Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. Nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by rolling hills and dense woods, lay the picturesque town of Willowshade. The town seemed untouched by time, with cobblestone streets, charming cottages, and gardens bursting with vibrant flowers. The people of Willowshade were strikingly beautiful, their faces unlined and youthful, their eyes bright with life. Visitors who stumbled upon the town marveled at its perfection. But beneath the idyllic surface of Willowshade was a dark and carefully guarded secret, a ghost who granted eternal youth at a price. On a warm spring evening, a traveler named Emily Hart, a freelance photographer in search of scenic landscapes, arrived in Willowshade. Emily had spent weeks exploring rural towns, but nothing prepared her for the beauty of Willowshade. She noticed something peculiar about the townspeople as she walked through the square. Everyone seemed unusually youthful, from the shopkeeper behind the bakery counter to the elderly man playing chess in the park. There were no signs of aging, no wrinkles or gray hair. Emily checked into the town's quaint inn, run by a cheerful woman named Margaret Layton, whose flawless complexion made her appear no older than 30. As they chatted, Margaret revealed that Willowshade had a unique tradition. "We celebrate the blessing of Eliza every year," Margaret said, her voice warm with pride. "Our patron spirit, Eliza, watches over us. She keeps us safe and healthy." Emily was intrigued but skeptical. She chalked it up to small-town superstition. That night, unable to sleep, Emily decided to take a walk through the town. The streets were eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. She wandered to the town square, where a large statue of a young woman stood at its center. The plaque read, "Eliza Moore, our eternal guardian, may her sacrifice never be forgotten." As Emily studied the statue, she heard a faint sound, like a distant melody carried on the wind. She turned, and for a split second, she saw a shimmering figure, a young woman with flowing hair, her eyes glowing faintly. Startled, Emily blinked, and the figure vanished. The next day, Emily questioned Margaret about the statue and the figure she had seen. Margaret hesitated, then shared the story of Eliza Moore. Over 200 years ago, Willowshade was a struggling farming community. Harsh winters and poor harvests left the town on the brink of collapse. According to legend, Eliza Moore, a kind-hearted young woman, prayed to the spirits of the forest for help. One fateful night, her prayers were answered, but at a cost. A mysterious spirit, veiled in shadow, offered Eliza a bargain, her life in exchange for the eternal prosperity of the town. Eliza accepted, and the spirit took her life, transforming her into a ghost bound to Willowshade. From that day forward, the town thrived. The crops flourished, and the townsfolk stopped aging, blessed with eternal youth. But there was a price. Each year during the blessing of Eliza, the town had to offer a tribute to the ghost. Emily grew increasingly curious about the tribute. She noticed that every villager she spoke to grew uneasy at her questions. Some deflected, others changed the subject entirely. One evening, Emily struck up a conversation with Daniel Grant, a reclusive man who lived on the outskirts of town. Daniel was different from the others. His face was lined with age, his hair streaked with gray. "They don't tell outsiders the whole truth," Daniel said grimly. "Eliza doesn't just demand tribute, she demands blood." According to Daniel, the tribute was a human life, chosen by the town's elders. The chosen individual was taken to the woods where Eliza's spirit resided, their blood spilled to sustain her power. In return, she continued to grant the townsfolk eternal youth and protection. Emily was horrified. "Why do you stay here?" she asked. Daniel's eyes darkened. "Because once you live here, you can't leave. Eliza won't let you." Determined to uncover the truth, Emily decided to stay in Willowshade until the blessing of Eliza, which was just days away. She began to notice more signs of the town's eerie perfection, the complete absence of illness, the ageless faces of the children, the lack of cemeteries. One night, she followed a group of villagers into the woods. They carried lanterns and walked in silence, their faces grim. She trailed them to a hidden clearing where a stone altar stood beneath an ancient willow tree. The villagers gathered around the altar, their murmured prayers filling the air. The figure of Eliza materialized, her ghostly form glowing with an unnatural light. Emily watched in horror as a young man was brought forward, his wrists bound. He was placed on the altar, and the chanting grew louder. Before the ritual could proceed, Emily's foot snapped a twig, and the villagers turned toward her. Emily tried to run, but the villagers captured her and dragged her to the altar. Eliza's ghost hovered above, her expression serene yet menacing. "You do not belong here," Eliza said, her voice echoing like a distant melody. "Outsiders disrupt the balance." Desperate, Emily pleaded with the villagers. "You don't have to do this. You're prisoners to this ritual, bound by fear. Break free." Her words struck a chord with Daniel, who had followed the group. "She's right," he shouted. "This has gone on long enough." The villagers hesitated, their faith wavering. Enraged, Eliza's ghost unleashed a chilling wail, and the wind howled through the clearing. The willow tree's branches lashed out like living tendrils, grabbing at the villagers. Emily spotted a pendant hanging from the ghost's neck, a shimmering crystal that pulsed with light. She realized it must be the source of Eliza's power. Summoning her courage, Emily broke free from her captors and lunged toward the ghost. She grabbed the pendant and yanked it free. Eliza let out an ear-piercing scream as her form began to dissolve. The pendant shattered, and the clearing was bathed in a brilliant light. When the light faded, Eliza was gone, and the villagers were left standing in stunned silence. With Eliza's spirit banished, the town's blessings faded. The villagers began to age, their youthful appearances replaced by the natural signs of time. The crops withered, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Emily left Willowshade, her photographs and notes documenting the chilling events. She published her story, but few believed her. Willowshade became a ghost town, its people either leaving or succumbing to the passage of time. The statue of Eliza crumbled, and the woods reclaimed the clearing where the rituals had taken place. But on quiet nights, some say you can still hear a faint melody in the wind, a reminder of the ghost who once held the town in her grasp. It started as a weekend getaway for a group of 5 friends. Lauren, the planner, had proposed a road trip to the remote wilderness of North Hollow, promising scenic trails, serene forests, and a break from the chaos of city life. Joining her were Ethan, her adventurous boyfriend, Megan, the skeptic, Derek, the tech-savvy photographer, and Jasmine, the quiet but curious artist. The trip began with laughter and lighthearted banter as they cruised along winding mountain roads. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the paved road gave way to a gravel path. Their GPS stopped working, and the trees seemed to close in around them. "This isn't on the map," Lauren muttered, frowning as the group consulted their printed guide. "It's fine," Ethan reassured. "We're probably just taking the scenic route." But unease began to creep in as the hours passed. The road seemed endless, and the sun dipped lower in the sky. Just as the group considered turning back, they spotted a sign, weathered and nearly illegible. The travelers arrived in a small village nestled in a clearing. The buildings were old, their wood weathered and darkened with age. Smoke curled from chimneys, and a handful of villagers went about their business, their movements slow and deliberate. Relieved to find signs of civilization, the group decided to stop and ask for directions. A man in his 40s, dressed in simple clothes, approached them. His smile was warm, but his eyes were unsettlingly intense. "Visitors are rare," he said, introducing himself as Elias, the village's caretaker. "You're just in time for our annual festival." "We're a little lost," Lauren explained. "We're trying to get back to the main road." Elias's smile widened. "The festival is tonight. Stay, rest. We'll help you in the morning." Despite Megan's protests, the group agreed to stay. The villagers offered them rooms in a large rustic inn, free of charge. It seemed too good to be true. As night fell, the village transformed. Lanterns lined the streets, casting an eerie golden glow. The villagers gathered in the square, singing a haunting melody that echoed through the forest. The friends were invited to join. They were given traditional cloaks to wear and cups of spiced wine. The warmth of the villagers' hospitality was almost enough to ease their unease. "Maybe this is just a quaint tradition," Ethan said, raising his cup. But Jasmine noticed something strange. All the villagers wore necklaces adorned with small, blood-red stones. When she asked about them, Elias simply said, "They're gifts from the Hollow." As the celebration continued, the friends began to feel disoriented. The wine had a bitter aftertaste, and the air felt heavy. Megan, always the skeptic, whispered, "Something's not right. We need to leave." Lauren hesitated. "It's just a festival. Let's not offend them." But Megan's instincts proved correct. The singing grew louder, more frenzied. Villagers began to move toward the edge of the woods, their lanterns casting long shadows on the ground. Elias approached the group, his smile now unnervingly wide. "It's time," he said. "Come with us." The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Time for what?" Derek asked. Elias didn't answer. The villagers surrounded the group, their cheerful demeanor replaced by something cold and unyielding. The villagers herded the friends into the forest, their protests ignored. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the trees pressing closer together. The haunting melody from earlier continued, but now it was accompanied by the rhythmic beating of drums. They arrived at a clearing dominated by a massive stone altar, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering firelight. Around the altar stood robed figures, their faces obscured. "This isn't right," Megan hissed. "We have to get out of here." Before they could act, Elias stepped forward. "The Hollow demands balance," he intoned. "For our prosperity, a life must be given." The friends froze. "You're joking," Ethan said, his voice cracking. Elias shook his head solemnly. "You were guided here for a reason. Outsiders are rare, but the Hollow always provides." Panic set in. Derek grabbed Jasmine's hand, whispering, "Run!" The group made a break for it, pushing past the villagers and darting into the forest. The drums grew louder, pounding like a heartbeat. The friends quickly realized the forest was working against them. The trees seemed to shift, creating barriers where none had been before. Lauren tripped and fell, crying out as twisted roots wrapped around her ankle. Ethan and Megan pulled her free, but the delay allowed the villagers to close in. Elias's voice echoed through the woods. "You cannot escape the Hollow." Back in the clearing, the villagers began chanting in unison. The air grew colder, and an unnatural wind swept through the forest. A figure began to form above the altar, a massive, shadowy being with glowing red eyes. Its presence was suffocating, its voice a guttural growl. "The Hollow is awake," Elias announced. The friends were dragged back to the clearing, their struggles futile. The Hollow's gaze fell on them, and it seemed to peer into their very souls. "Choose," Elias commanded. "One must stay." The friends looked at one another in horror. "We're not choosing," Megan shouted, but the Hollow spoke, its voice reverberating through the clearing. "If no one is chosen, all will remain." Desperation set in. Ethan stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "Take me. Let the others go." "No!" Lauren screamed, trying to pull him back. Elias nodded approvingly. "Your bravery will be remembered." The villagers seized Ethan and led him to the altar. As the ritual began, the Hollow's form grew darker, its power intensifying. Ethan locked eyes with Lauren one last time before the shadows consumed him. When the ritual was complete, the villagers released the remaining friends. Weak and broken, they stumbled back to their car. The road, once lost, now reappeared. As they drove away, no one spoke. The laughter and joy they had shared at the start of their trip were gone, replaced by a heavy silence. Back in the city, they tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed them. The memories of the Hollow haunted their dreams, and the guilt of leaving Ethan behind was a weight they would carry forever. Far away in the heart of the forest, the village of Hollow's End prepared for another year of prosperity, their secret safe once more. And the Hollow waited, its hunger never truly sated. Deep in the mountains, hidden among the shadows of ancient pines, was a decaying mansion known as Blackthorn Manor. The locals whispered dark tales about the place, claiming it was cursed, but few dared venture close enough to find out. Blackthorn Manor was home to the cult of the Crimson Dawn, a secretive group of zealots who worshipped a forgotten deity known only as the Herald of the Abyss. They believed the Herald was imprisoned in another realm, and by freeing it, they would usher in a new era of power and prosperity. The leader of the cult, Evangeline Price, was a charismatic woman with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see into the soul. She had spent decades studying forbidden texts and deciphering ancient runes to prepare for the ultimate ceremony, a ritual to open the gates of the abyss and release the herald. Evangeline's followers were a mix of the desperate, the power-hungry, and the fanatically loyal. They called themselves the Chosen, believing they would be rewarded with unimaginable power when the herald walked the earth. On the night of the summer solstice, under a blood-red moon, the Chosen gathered in the mansion's underground chamber. The room was massive, its walls lined with torches that cast flickering shadows over the intricate symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the chamber lay a massive altar, surrounded by a circular engraving of the seal of the abyss, an ancient design said to bridge the worlds of the living and the damned. The air was heavy with the scent of burning incense and blood. The cult had spent weeks collecting sacrifices, animals, relics, and, as rumors whispered, a few unlucky wanderers who had stumbled too close to the manor. Evangeline stood at the altar, clad in a crimson robe that shimmered like liquid fire. She held a ceremonial dagger, its blade inscribed with runes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Around her, the Chosen chanted in a language long forgotten, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody. As the ritual reached its climax, Evangeline raised the dagger high and plunged it into the heart of a blackened idol on the altar. The room fell silent, the flames of the torches flickering wildly as a deep rumble echoed from beneath the earth. For a moment, nothing happened. The Chosen exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if something had gone wrong. Then the seal of the abyss began to glow, its carvings filled with an unearthly light. The ground trembled violently, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the chamber. The air grew icy, and an unnatural wind swept through the room, extinguishing the torches. A crack formed in the center of the seal, glowing with a fiery red light. The crack widened, and from its depths came a chorus of wails, agonized, inhuman cries that sent shivers down the spines of even the most devoted cultists. The herald had not come alone. A massive, clawed hand emerged from the crack, followed by another. The creature that pulled itself free was a towering monstrosity, its form constantly shifting between flesh, shadow, and fire. Its eyes burned like twin suns, and its mouth twisted into a grin filled with jagged, obsidian teeth. But the herald was not the only entity to emerge. Behind it, smaller creatures began to crawl out of the abyss, twisted, grotesque forms with too many limbs and faces that seemed to scream silently. The Chosen froze in terror. This was not the salvation they had been promised. This was chaos incarnate. "Do not falter," Evangeline cried, her voice shaking but resolute. "This is the herald's test. Prove your loyalty." But loyalty meant nothing in the face of the horrors that poured from the gate. The creatures attacked without hesitation, tearing through the Chosen like paper. The chamber filled with screams, blood, and the sound of flesh being ripped apart. A handful of cultists, realizing the ritual had gone horribly wrong, fled the chamber. Among them was Samuel Byrne, a disillusioned member who had joined the cult in search of meaning. As he ran through the twisting corridors of Blackthorn Manor, he could hear the chaos spreading. The creatures were not confined to the chamber. They were pouring into the mansion, killing everything in their path. Samuel burst into the main hall, where a few other survivors had gathered. Among them was Clara, a young woman who had been coerced into the cult by her family. "We have to stop it," Clara said, her voice trembling. "There has to be a way to close the gate." Samuel shook his head. "The ritual was irreversible. We were fools to think we could control this." "But if we don't try, it'll destroy everything," Clara insisted. Reluctantly, Samuel agreed. Together, they searched the manor for anything that could reverse the ritual. The two stumbled upon Evangeline in the library, frantically flipping through an ancient tome. She looked up, her face streaked with blood, but her eyes still burning with determination. "You don't understand," she said. "The Herald's power will remake the world. This is destiny." Samuel pointed a pistol he had scavenged at her. "Your destiny is killing everyone. Tell us how to stop it." Evangeline laughed bitterly. "You can't. The gate will only close when it consumes enough souls to sate its hunger, and by then, it will already be too late. Before Samuel could respond, a creature burst into the room, its many eyes fixed on them. Evangeline screamed as it lunged at her, tearing her apart in seconds. Samuel and Clara barely escaped, barricading themselves in another room. Outside the manor, the horrors unleashed by the ritual were spreading. The skies turned blood red, and the earth cracked, releasing rivers of molten lava. Towns and cities far from Blackthorn began to report sightings of monstrous beings. Samuel and Clara managed to make it out of the manor, but the sight that greeted them was a vision of hell. Fires raged across the forest, and the screams of the dying echoed through the night. "We have to warn people," Clara said. "Warn them about what?" Samuel replied. "The gates are open. There's no stopping it now." Despite his despair, Samuel knew they had to try. He and Clara headed toward a nearby town, hoping to find survivors and perhaps someone with knowledge of how to fight the horrors. As they traveled, they saw more of the creatures, each more horrifying than the last. The herald itself remained at Blackthorn Manor, its massive form looming over the landscape like a living nightmare. Though they didn't know it, Samuel and Clara's actions would inspire others to resist the horrors. A resistance would form, fighting back against the creatures and searching for a way to close the gates. But for now, the world burned and the gates of hell remained wide open. Elias Kane was a man who could command a room with his voice alone. Tall, with sharp features and piercing green eyes, he had a magnetic presence that drew people in. His sermons were fiery and passionate, blending scripture with a promise of divine salvation and personal empowerment. He founded the Church of the Eternal Flame, a congregation that started in a small town but quickly spread like wildfire. What began as a few dozen followers grew to hundreds, then thousands. They believed Elias was more than a man. He was a chosen prophet, a bridge between humanity and the divine. The message was simple but seductive. Shed your doubts, embrace the flame, and be reborn in its glory. His followers gave up their possessions, severed ties with family and friends, and devoted their lives to Elias and his teachings. But beneath the surface of his sermons was something darker. The flame Elias preached about was no heavenly light. It was something ancient, primal, and hungry. Among Elias's most loyal followers was Sarah Whitfield, a young woman who had joined the church after a personal tragedy. Drawn to Elias's message of renewal, she quickly rose in the ranks of the congregation, becoming one of his trusted confidants. It was Sarah who first noticed the changes. Elias's sermons became more intense, his language more cryptic. He began speaking of the true flame, a force that existed beyond the comprehension of mortals. Late one night, Sarah was summoned to a secret meeting in the church's underground chamber. There, she found a group of Elias's inner circle gathered around a strange, circular altar etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist when she looked at them. Elias stood at the center, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim candlelight. "Tonight," he announced, "we commune with the flame itself. The truth shall be revealed." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. Elias chanted in a guttural language that made her skin crawl. The air grew heavy, and the temperature in the room plummeted. As the chanting reached its peak, the altar began to glow, and a shadowy figure appeared, a form wreathed in fire and smoke. "The flame has answered," Elias declared, his voice echoing unnaturally. The shadowy figure lunged at Elias, and for a moment, the room was consumed by a blinding light. When the light faded, Elias stood motionless, his head bowed. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked hesitantly. Elias raised his head, and when he opened his eyes, they were pitch black. A sinister smile spread across his face. "I have seen the flame," he said, his voice layered with an otherworldly resonance. The congregation was awestruck, believing their leader had been blessed, but Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong. In the weeks that followed, the church's doctrine shifted. Elias's sermons became darker, focusing on sacrifice and obedience. He claimed the flame demanded more from its followers, acts of devotion that tested their faith. Under Elias's orders, the congregation began to build a massive bonfire in the woods behind the church. He spoke of a grand ceremony that would bring them closer to the flame than ever before. Sarah grew increasingly uneasy. Elias's behavior was erratic. He would vanish for hours, only to return covered in ash and reeking of burnt flesh. His temper flared over minor infractions, and his once charismatic demeanor was now tinged with menace. One night, Sarah followed him into the woods. Hidden among the trees, she watched as he knelt before the bonfire, speaking in the same guttural language she had heard during the ritual. The flames rose unnaturally high, and a shadowy figure emerged, a demon wreathed in fire. Elias bowed before it, his voice trembling. "What is your will, master?" The demon's reply was a chilling command. "The gates must open. The flame must consume." Horrified, Sarah confronted Elias the next day. "What are you doing? This isn't divine. It's evil." Elias laughed, a low, guttural sound. "You're right, Sarah. It is evil. But evil is power. The flame is the source of all creation and destruction, and I am its vessel." Sarah realized then that Elias was no longer the man she had followed. He was possessed, his body a puppet for the demon that called itself the flame. Elias revealed his plan. The grand ceremony was not meant to bring salvation. It was a ritual to open a portal to the demon's realm, allowing its kind to enter the world. "Imagine it, Sarah," he said, his eyes burning with unnatural light. "A world remade in fire, a world where we are gods." Sarah knew she had to stop him, but she couldn't do it alone. She secretly reached out to other members of the congregation who had grown uneasy with Elias's recent behavior. Among them were Jacob, a former soldier, Miriam, an elderly scholar with knowledge of ancient texts, and Daniel, a skeptic who had never fully bought into the church's teachings. Together, they devised a plan to stop the ceremony. Miriam discovered a passage in an ancient grimoire that described a way to banish a possessing demon. The ritual required courage, precision, and an item that had once belonged to the possessed, a reminder of their humanity. Sarah volunteered to retrieve the item, a locket Elias had worn since the church's founding, containing a photo of his late wife. On the night of the ceremony, the congregation gathered around the bonfire, their chants echoing through the woods. Elias stood at the center, his arms raised as he called forth the flame. The fire roared, growing impossibly large, and the air filled with the sound of inhuman wails. Sarah and her allies moved quickly. As the portal began to form in the flames, Sarah approached Elias, holding the locket. "Elias, this isn't you," she shouted. For a brief moment, the man she had once known resurfaced. His eyes softened, and he whispered, "Sarah." But the demon's hold was strong. With a roar, it regained control, lunging at Sarah. Jacob and Daniel tackled Elias, holding him down while Miriam recited the banishment ritual. The fire dimmed, and the portal began to close. The demon screamed in rage, its shadowy form writhing as it was forced back into the abyss. When the ritual ended, Elias lay unconscious, the bonfire reduced to smoldering embers. The congregation, confused and frightened, scattered into the night. Elias awoke, his eyes filled with tears. "What have I done?" he whispered. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were deceived, but it's over now." Though the immediate danger had passed, Sarah knew the demon's influence lingered. The Church of the Eternal Flame was disbanded, but the scars it left on its followers and the world would not fade easily. Elias, racked with guilt, vowed to spend the rest of his life seeking redemption. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the flame was not truly extinguished. Deep in the shadows, it waited, smoldering, ready to rise again. The sprawling, decrepit mansion sat on the edge of town like a brooding sentinel, its windows dark and lifeless. Locals called it Evercrest, but more often it was referred to as the Cursed House. For decades, rumors swirled about what had happened there. A family tragedy, a brutal murder, and whispers of a restless spirit. When Emma Brooks, an aspiring journalist with a nose for unsolved mysteries, heard about the mansion, she knew it could be the story that launched her career. Evercrest's story was tantalizing. 20 years earlier, a young woman named Isabel Thorne had disappeared from the house during a lavish party. Her body was never found, and no one had been charged with a crime. Emma wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but the intrigue surrounding Isabel's disappearance was too compelling to ignore. She decided to spend a weekend at Evercrest, determined to uncover the truth. The mansion greeted Emma with creaking floorboards and the faint smell of decay. Dust blanketed the ornate furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten drapes. She set up her equipment in the grand parlor, a laptop, a voice recorder, and a camera. The first few hours were uneventful. She explored the house, documenting its eerie charm. As night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier, the silence oppressive. Just as she was about to call it a night, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the air seemed to hum with energy. A faint, whispering voice broke the silence. "Help me!" Emma froze, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The voice came again, soft and plaintive. "Help me find the truth. Find me." Emma's skepticism wavered. Gathering her courage, she followed the voice to the second floor, where it led her to a locked door. The whispers ceased, leaving her in unnerving silence. The next morning, Emma found a rusted key in the library. It seemed out of place, as if someone had deliberately left it for her to find. She returned to the locked door and opened it, revealing a small study filled with books and personal belongings. On the desk lay an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The name Isabel Thorne was embossed on the front. Inside were fragments of Isabel's thoughts, descriptions of the lavish parties, her strained relationship with her family, and entries hinting at a secret romance. One passage stood out. "The truth lies beneath the rosewood tree. It is my only escape." Emma didn't understand the reference, but the words filled her with a strange sense of urgency. That night, the whispers returned. "Find the rosewood tree," the voice urged. "You must see. You must know." The next day, Emma explored the grounds surrounding the mansion. In the overgrown garden, she found a gnarled rosewood tree. Beneath its roots, she discovered a small wooden box, its lid carved with intricate patterns. Inside was a blood-stained locket and a folded letter. The letter was addressed to Andrew Blackwood, a prominent businessman who had been a guest at the party the night Isabel disappeared. The letter's content shocked Emma. "Andrew, you promised me freedom, but instead you brought ruin. I cannot escape you, but I will not let you destroy me. If anything happens to me, know that my heart belongs to another, and my silence will haunt you forever." The locket contained a photo of Isabel and a man Emma didn't recognize. That night, Emma confronted the whispers. "Isabel, is that you? I found the locket. What does it mean?" The temperature in the room plummeted, and a faint, glowing figure appeared. Isabel Thorne stood before her, translucent but heartbreakingly beautiful. Her expression was a mix of sorrow and determination. "You've done well," Isabel said, her voice echoing softly. "But the truth lies deeper still. Andrew betrayed me, but he wasn't the only one. They all conspired against me. My death was no accident." "Who?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Isabel's form flickered. "The ledger in the study, it holds their names. Trust no one." Before Emma could ask more, Isabel vanished, leaving her with a renewed sense of purpose. Emma searched the study and found a hidden compartment in the desk. Inside was a ledger detailing payments made to various individuals shortly before Isabel's disappearance. The names included Andrew Blackwood, the housekeeper, and even Isabel's own brother, Victor Thorne. It became clear that Isabel had been silenced to protect a dark secret, one involving blackmail, betrayal, and greed. Emma's investigation attracted attention. Her posts about Evercrest on social media caught the eye of Victor Thorne, now a wealthy and influential man. He arrived at the mansion unannounced, feigning concern for her safety. "You should leave this place," Victor said. "It's dangerous. People get lost in their obsession with the past." Emma confronted him with the evidence. "You were involved in your sister's death, weren't you? What were you trying to hide?" Victor's mask of concern slipped. "You don't understand. Isabel was reckless. She was going to ruin us all with her scandalous behavior. We had no choice." "No choice?" Emma shot back. "You killed her!" Victor lunged at Emma, but before he could reach her, the room filled with an unearthly wind. Isabel's ghost appeared, her presence radiating fury. "You betrayed me, Victor," Isabel said, her voice a haunting echo. "You stole my life for your greed. Now you will answer for your sins." Victor screamed as the ghostly wind swirled around him. Isabel's wrath consumed him, and when the wind ceased, he was gone, leaving only silence. With Victor gone, Isabel turned to Emma, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said. "You gave me the justice I could not find in life. I can rest now." Emma watched as Isabel's form faded, her spirit finally at peace. Emma left Evercrest with the evidence she had uncovered. Her exposé on the Thorne family and Isabel's tragic fate became a sensation, shedding light on the dark secrets that had haunted the mansion for decades. But Emma knew the true story went beyond the headlines. Isabel's voice, once a whisper in the shadows, had found its way into the light. And somewhere, Emma hoped, Isabel had found the peace she deserved. For years, Margaret Maggie Fields had been a respected novelist. Her thrillers and mysteries were staples on bestseller lists. But lately, her creative well had run dry. Deadlines loomed, and her editor's emails had grown increasingly terse. Desperate for inspiration, Maggie decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods, far from the distractions of city life. The cabin was picturesque, but isolated, surrounded by towering pines that whispered in the wind. Inside, it was simple yet cozy, with a crackling fireplace, a sturdy oak desk, and shelves lined with old books. Maggie felt a twinge of hope as she settled in, determined to write her next masterpiece. But her first few days were unproductive. The words wouldn't come. She spent hours staring at her laptop screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. At night, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin or the rustling of leaves outside. Then on the fourth night, something changed. Maggie awoke to the sound of faint whispering. Groggy, she glanced around the dark room, her heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, forming fragmented sentences. "Tell my story. Forgotten. Lost." She sat up, clutching the blanket tightly. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispers ceased, and the cabin fell silent again. Convinced it was her overactive imagination or the stress of writer's block, Maggie dismissed the incident. But the next day she found a single sheet of paper on her desk. It was yellowed with age, the edges curled, and written in an elegant, looping script was a single sentence. Maggie stared at the note, her mind racing. She hadn't brought any old paper with her, and no one else could have entered the cabin. Unease settled over her, but curiosity soon took hold. "Who are you?" she whispered into the empty room. At first, there was no response. Then the temperature dropped, and a faint, translucent figure appeared near the fireplace. It was a woman, her features delicate and her expression sorrowful. She wore a dress that seemed to belong to another era, its hem stained with what looked like blood. "My name is Eleanor Gray," the spirit said, her voice soft but firm. "And you must tell my story." Maggie felt her knees weaken. "What? What happened to you?" "I was a writer, like you," Eleanor began. "But my words angered the wrong people. They silenced me, stole my story, and erased my name. You are my last chance to be remembered." Over the following nights, Eleanor revealed fragments of her tragic tale. She had lived in the late 19th century, a time when women writers were often dismissed or plagiarized. Eleanor had penned a novel that exposed corruption among powerful men in her town, a daring act that had cost her dearly. "They said my words were lies," Eleanor explained, her ghostly form flickering. "But the truth was too dangerous for them to allow. They came for me one night, dragged me from my home. I never returned." Maggie felt a mix of horror and fascination. "How did you die?" Eleanor hesitated, her expression darkening. "That is for you to uncover. My story is incomplete, even to me. I need you to find the truth and write it as it deserves to be told." Determined to help the spirit, Maggie began researching Eleanor Gray. Her initial searches yielded little. Eleanor's name appeared only in a few local records, listing her as a novelist who had mysteriously disappeared in 1892. Maggie visited the nearest town, poring over archives in the dusty library. There she uncovered an article from an old newspaper. "Scandalous novelist missing, foul play suspected." The article described Eleanor as a controversial figure whose writings had sparked outrage among influential townsfolk. Witnesses claimed to have seen her arguing with a man named Charles Whitmore, a wealthy landowner, shortly before her disappearance. Further digging revealed whispers of a cover-up. Charles Whitmore had connections to the local police and courts. He denied any involvement in Eleanor's disappearance, and the investigation had been quickly abandoned. Maggie shared her findings with Eleanor. The ghost listened intently, her translucent hands trembling. "Charles," she whispered, "he hated me. He wanted me silenced. But I cannot remember what happened that night." Eleanor mentioned a manuscript she had been working on before her death, a novel that detailed the corruption in Whitmore's circle. "They tried to destroy it," she said, "but I hid the pages. You must find them." Maggie searched the cabin, guided by Eleanor's fragmented memories. In the attic, behind a loose floorboard, she found a leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, filled with Eleanor's beautiful handwriting. The story was raw and powerful, a thinly veiled account of the corruption she had uncovered. As Maggie read, she realized the manuscript named names and detailed crimes that could ruin Whitmore and his associates. This was why they had silenced Eleanor. Eleanor's presence grew stronger as Maggie worked to piece together the story. But as the manuscript neared completion, strange occurrences began to plague the cabin. Objects moved on their own, shadowy figures appeared in the corners of her vision, and threatening whispers filled the night. Maggie realized the spirits of those who had wronged Eleanor were trying to stop her. "They fear the truth," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "but you must finish." One night, the oppressive presence became overwhelming. The shadows coalesced into a dark, writhing figure that loomed over Maggie. It hissed, "Leave her story buried or suffer the same fate." Eleanor stepped forward, her form glowing with determination. "No more," she declared. "You cannot silence me again." With Eleanor's help, Maggie banished the dark spirit, driving it back into the shadows. Finally, Maggie finished the manuscript. She titled it "The Forgotten Voice" and ensured it included Eleanor's name and story. The novel was published to critical acclaim, sparking renewed interest in Eleanor Gray and her tragic life. But Maggie knew the true victory was Eleanor's peace. On the night of the book's release, the ghost appeared one last time. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her form shimmering. "You gave me my voice back. I can finally rest." As Eleanor faded into the light, Maggie felt a profound sense of closure. The Forgotten Voice became a bestseller, and Eleanor Gray's story inspired countless readers. Maggie went on to write more novels, but none resonated with her as deeply as the tale of the ghost who demanded her truth be told. And though she would never admit it to anyone, sometimes late at night, she thought she could hear Eleanor's voice, soft, encouraging, and eternally grateful. The old chapel on the edge of the sleepy town of Willow Creek was an architectural marvel, with its stained glass windows casting kaleidoscopic light and ivy creeping up its ancient stone walls. But it wasn't the beauty of the chapel that kept the townsfolk talking. It was the legend of the bride. Every local knew the story. Decades ago, a young woman named Lillian Rosewood had died tragically on her wedding day. Since then, her restless spirit was said to haunt the chapel, forever mourning the life she never got to live. People claimed to hear sobbing at night, to see the ghostly figure of a bride standing at the altar, her veil fluttering as though moved by an unseen wind. The townspeople avoided the chapel at night. Some avoided it altogether. But for Emily Warren, an ambitious journalist looking to make a name for herself, the tale of the ghost bride was an irresistible story waiting to be uncovered. Emily had recently moved to Willow Creek, drawn by its charm and steeped history. The story of the haunted chapel was exactly the kind of sensational piece she needed to launch her career. Despite warnings from locals, she decided to investigate. She started with the town's records, uncovering details of Lillian Rosewood's life. Lillian had been the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Her wedding to Edward Thatcher, a humble school teacher, had been the talk of the town, a union that defied societal expectations. But tragedy struck on the wedding day. According to newspaper clippings, a fire had broken out in the chapel during the ceremony. Lillian had perished in the blaze, and Edward, devastated, had disappeared shortly afterward. Some claimed he had taken his own life, while others whispered that he had been driven mad by grief. Emily's curiosity deepened. What had caused the fire? And why did Lillian's spirit remain tethered to the chapel? Determined to experience the haunting herself, Emily decided to spend a night in the chapel. Armed with a notebook, a voice recorder, and a camera, she arrived at dusk. The chapel was eerily quiet. the air heavy with the scent of old wood and faint traces of incense. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and an unnatural stillness settled over the room. Emily sat in one of the pews, her senses on high alert. Hours passed, and she began to wonder if the legend was nothing more than a myth. Then just after midnight, she heard it, a soft, mournful sobbing. Emily's breath caught. The sound seemed to echo from the altar. She gripped her flashlight and crept forward, her heart pounding. At first, she saw nothing. But then, in the pale moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows, a figure materialized. A woman in a tattered wedding dress, her veil obscuring her face. "Lillian," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. The figure turned toward her. Though the veil covered her features, Emily could feel the weight of her sorrow. "Why are you here?" the ghost asked, her voice a haunting melody of pain and longing. "I want to know your story," Emily said, summoning her courage. "Why are you still here?" The ghost hesitated, then began to speak. "I cannot leave, Juana," Lillian said. "Not until the truth is known. Not until justice is served." Lillian's words sent chills down Emily's spine. "What truth?" she asked. "The fire." Lillian's voice faltered. "It was no accident. Someone wanted me gone." Before Emily could ask more, the ghost faded, leaving her alone in the chapel. The next morning, Emily delved deeper into the town's history. She uncovered rumors of a rivalry between Lillian's family and another prominent family in the town, the Whitmores. The two families had feuded over land for years, and Lillian's marriage to Edward, who had ties to the Whitmores, had further inflamed tensions. Emily began to suspect that the fire had been intentionally set. But who would go to such lengths, and why? Emily interviewed elderly residents who still remembered the tragedy. One woman, Mrs. Harlow, offered a chilling revelation. Lillian's father, Charles Rosewood, was furious about the wedding, Mrs. Harlow said. He thought Edward wasn't good enough for her. There were whispers that he threatened to stop the wedding at any cost. Emily's investigation also led her to an old caretaker of the chapel, Thomas Grayson, who had been a boy at the time of the fire. "I saw someone that day," Thomas admitted reluctantly, "a man with a lantern sneaking around the back of the chapel. I thought nothing of it then, but now..." The pieces began to fall into place. Emily suspected that Charles Rosewood had orchestrated the fire to prevent the marriage. But his plan had gone horribly wrong, costing his daughter her life. That night, Emily returned to the chapel to share what she had learned. At midnight, Lillian's ghost appeared once more. "I know the truth," Emily said. "Your father caused the fire. He didn't want you to marry Edward." Lillian's form flickered, her sorrow giving way to anger. "I suspected as much," she said, "but I need proof. Only then can I find peace." Emily remembered the records she had found, documents suggesting that Charles had paid large sums of money to local officials after the fire. She promised Lillian she would find the evidence needed to expose the truth. Emily scoured the town archives, eventually discovering a journal belonging to Charles Rosewood. In it, he had confessed his guilt, writing, "I only meant to scare them, to stop the wedding. I never wanted her to die. But the fire spread too quickly. I cannot forgive myself, but I must protect my name." Armed with this damning evidence, Emily returned to the chapel. "I found it," she told Lillian's ghost, holding up the journal. "The world will know what happened to you." Lillian's ghost wept, but this time her tears were of gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "You've given me what I've waited for all these years. I can finally rest." As the first light of dawn broke through the stained glass windows, Lillian's ghost began to fade, her form dissolving into a soft golden light. Emily's story about Lillian Rosewood became a nationwide sensation. The chapel, once shrouded in fear and mystery, was restored and became a symbol of love and resilience. Though Lillian's ghost was gone, her story lived on, ensuring she was never forgotten. And Emily, who had uncovered the truth, found not just professional success, but also a deep connection to the tragic bride whose spirit had finally been set free.